First of all, we have a very brief selection here of different types of classic design styles we'll find from the 18th century up to the 1950s and 60s. I think what's important to try and do if you're wanting to pursue this further is to build up a visual vocabulary for yourself of the basic design styles. And that way you can almost spot something's broad date range at 100 paces. And it is a very useful way of at least narrowing down the date of an artifact. So let's start here with what I suppose would be classified as sort of late Georgian design. What we've got here is very much a regular design. It's quite symmetrical. In a lot of cases, not here, you'd have classical motifs such as columns or pediments, or sometimes sort of ox skulls with garlands of flowers draped from the horns. This is much more restrained, probably dates to about 1780, 1800, but is a good example of how that sort of 18th century style is typified in a fairly mundane object. The second object we've got here is actually a reproduction from the 1980s of a mid-19th century jug, which has what would be classified as Gothic tracery, harking back to medieval architectural styles before the rediscovery and the appreciation of classical styles. And so there's a lot of what would be classified as pointed arches with maybe medieval or ecclesiastical figures in there, and even the handler's got a sort of pointiness to it. So Gothic or Neo-Gothic is a hard style to define. It's certainly around from the 1740s, and to some extent even now is still with us in various forms. But there was a big revival of Gothic architecture in the middle of the 19th century, and you only have to think about the Houses of Parliament and how they were rebuilt in a Gothic style to get a feel for that overall design language. The next style we're going to look at is what we call aesthetic. This came in the 1860s and 70s and ran on till about the 1900s. It often uses floral motifs, tends to be fairly asymmetrical. I know this is a pen holder, so it would be asymmetrical, but you have that sort of feel here with this decoration following naturalistic forms. The sunflower particularly was a strong motif that you see in a lot of aesthetic art and design. Sort of taking inspiration from that, but something that really became very asymmetrical but still obsessed with natural forms was what we classify as Art Nouveau, which developed in the 1890s and specializes in having these very naturalistic forms, very swirling designs, lots of flowers, lots of sort of little bugs crawling up the flowers. It's very much an urban design, something that was sort of very much popular started in Paris, but also in Vienna and Barcelona, and very much sort of was the great sort of design of the turn of the century. Another design that's sort of disregarded now came in the 1910, 1920s period, and is a hark back to that 18th century style. Little classical motifs, quite dainty, taking inspiration often from earlier, even very early Georgian styles, but an awful lot of domestic cutlery tends to be having this sort of rather nice sort of beadwork and this reed work around it. As I said, harking back to sort of, well, not just 1780s, but even earlier. So it's like a neoclassicism of that again went through an awful lot of architecture as well, right up until the 1930s. From, well, either just before or just after the First World War, with the advent of things like Cubism, etc., a whole new, quite radical style developed, which is generically known as Art Deco. And here you have geometric forms, quite hard-edged, a huge contrast to the naturalism of Art Nouveau, and to some extent, by some, seen as a reaction to it. So again, quite a very easy style to spot. Things like early cinemas, for instance, often have lots of Art Deco decoration. And then after the Second World War, particularly in this country, influenced partly by the Festival of Britain, but also later on by other things such as space exploration, etc. You get what I suppose would be called now sort of 1950s, 60s sort of modern designs. An awful lot of ceramics tend to take up these designs. So I'm not sure whether this is supposed to be sort of microbes or bugs of some sort, but you get these quite sort of striking use of colours. Sometimes it can be quite twee as well, little signs of sort of Parisian cafes or obsession with palm trees and other exotic fruits, etc. It's a sort of reaction against the rather great boring quality of life during the Second World War. It's bright, it's cheery, it's optimistic, it's clean. It's trying to move away from the old fusty-dustinesses of Georgianism or the sort of swirly naturalism of Art Nouveau. So it's a very short run through design styles, but if an artifact you have exhibits any of these or some of the other styles that you can no doubt sort of work out in between, for instance, there's a Neo-Egyptian style that would fit into there, then it gives you at least some idea of the date at which, or the period at which, these artifacts were created.